Well, good evening. I'm really glad to see all of you here. I'm Ann McGlone, and I just have to tell you that it is such a privilege and really a delight to have worked with you all in Mission Hills for the past almost a year now. That Dave and I have been coming up, and this has just been a lovely place to work. You have all been very kind and gracious to us, and staff has been incredibly helpful. We've done design guidelines and work for lots of cities, and I have to say that this is truly one of the most delightful places that we have ever been. I want to thank you, I want to thank all the volunteers who have helped us during this process. Lots and lots of your neighbors and friends have sort of been with us through this and attended a lot of public meetings. And I know that you're taking time out of your busy schedule to be here today, and we're really appreciative of that. And I want to thank you all for being here tonight. What we're going to, the reason that we're here are design guidelines, and we hope that this is something that will not surprise you, that you will, as we've gone along this process, that we hope that we've listened to you, and that what you're going to see tonight reflects what we've said. We're here because the City Council and the Planning Commission said they were looking for a tool to help with the design review process here in Mission Hills, that they were looking for something that was systematically and efficiently could be applied to the process so that everybody knew what was going on, whether you were a resident who's lived here for a really long time, a prospective property owner that's looking to buy property in Alamo Heights, or that you're a neighbor to somebody who is thinking of doing something to their house. So we're trying to, we're hopefully going to, the document is meant for all of you to do that. Design guidelines are nothing new. They're part of good planning practice. And I think that Mission Hills probably deserves 5 stars for having been one of the earliest cities, if not the earliest, to just base their whole city and their whole city design on good planning practices. The rest of the country looks to you as a model for creating such a wonderful, wonderful place. And so what these design guidelines, there shouldn't be anything new in here, because what we've done is we've just looked at those old patterns and hopefully expressed those to you about what you have, not what you need, but we're looking at those patterns about what you already have. The intent of the guidelines is to be friendly, to be helpful, that they're supposed to make the process easier. So that, and they sort of, they set a baseline so that everybody is sort of talking off the same page and at the same time. And so our intent is that they're friendly and helpful documents. They're based on the comprehensive plan, which you adopted a number of years ago. And one of the main things that's said in the comprehensive plan is it talks about maintaining and protecting the historical patterns that are part of Mission Hills. And what we want to do is to help define what those patterns are. And that's really all this book is about. It's recognizing those patterns. The other thing we wanted to tell you was that although we are the out-of-town experts, and I wish I had enough hands to do quotes on both sides here, these are not our design guidelines. They're not something that we pulled off the shelf and that we just changed the name on the computer to select all the other towns' names and put in Mission Hills. These are specifically your design guidelines. We came in May and had a conversation with, I think, over 80 individuals asking about what you thought was important in Mission Hills and what were the underlying attributes that made Mission Hills Mission Hills. We went back, we did a lot of studying, we looked at a lot of patterns, and we came back to you in July and said, did we get it right? Here's the patterns we see. Are we right? Are we wrong? We were here for an entire week, and we had 2 big public meetings over at the Mission Hills Country Club that a lot of you attended. And from there, we took to heart what you said and went back and actually started writing, and the design guidelines came back in October, had a series of public meetings where we presented those design guidelines. The video, I forgot, they videoed us in July, and that video has been up since July, talking about what those principles were. And then you had some tweaks for us from our public meeting then, so we went back, we made those in January, came back, had some more public meetings, and now we're back in February for what we're calling our final public draft. So thank you all for being here tonight. I think I got all my meetings that we had right on that. So the main idea is to balance the interest of the property owners, the prospective property owners, and the neighbors, and basically document what it is you have here as part of the pattern. We looked at green space patterns when we were here, and we said, what's the thing you love about Mission Hills the most? I was really surprised because I thought I was going to get architectural stuff because we were writing design guidelines. Everybody said green space. So green space patterns were really important to us. Lot configurations, the patterns of massing in your neighborhood, and the house patterns. What makes a Mission Hills house a Mission Hills house, and what doesn't? So we looked at all those patterns. And so we're here not to tell you what you need as design guidelines, but we're really here to tell you what we've got. So I'm going to turn it over. One more thing I was going to tell you. You might have seen the document, and you could say, well, how could it be 100 pages long if it's just some sort of really basic, simple ideas about green space and lot size and mass configuration? How did it get to be 100 pages long? And it's because there's some subtle variations, some variety and complexity about all your sites. And so we've tried to touch on each of those conditions. If you were building a new house in Mission Hills, you probably wouldn't read it. Well, you might from start to finish. If you were building a new house, you would. But there are parts that just particularly apply to where you are in the neighborhood. So as Dave goes through, listen to the different parts that make up that, and he's going to walk you through our document. And then we're going to hold the questions because this is being videotaped. And what we'd also, so we don't want to interrupt the videotaping with questions, but we also want to make sure that all the questions are part of the public record. So after Dave and I have spoken, the Planning Commission is going to convene so that all your comments are part of the public record. So that's how we're going to do the questions. So
thank you very much, Ann. Well, as she said, we're really pleased to be here talking to you folks about this. We've had this is a very, very interesting project for us just from an intellectual and professional standpoint, because as she mentioned, your city is sort of a model throughout the country. Your city in particular, and the Country Club District in general, is one of the best models of a town that was built from scratch with some very clear overarching planning ideas in this century, excuse me, the previous century. I'm lost in time here. In the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's one of the best examples of communities built from scratch in the 20th century. And so it's been a great pleasure to us to get to know it better. The main objectives of the guidelines, as Ann alluded to, are to help clarify what the comprehensive plan means when it says to maintain the historical integrity of each part of Mission Hills. Another key objective is to just help the community agree upon what are the design attributes that are most valued by the community. We've heard a lot about that and hit a couple of the high points. To enable everybody involved with the design review process to fairly sort of anticipate what the Architectural Review Board is going to be looking for in relation to a particular sort of house in a particular part of town on a particular kind of lot, so that your design process and your approval process can be more straightforward rather than a trial and error effort. And last, to balance the interest of each property owner in realizing their aspirations on their lot against the interests of their neighbors and other folks in the community, in making sure that over time it's still Mission Hills, that each new house, the addition of houses over time and changes to houses over time still add up to the Mission Hills that everybody decided they wanted to live in and invested, significantly in to live here. So the 4 chapters of the document, as we've organized it, are first understanding Mission Hills, and that's only about 12 pages. That's really sort of a primer that somebody coming into Mission Hills from somewhere else could read and get a pretty good grip on what's up with Mission Hills and what's important in planning and design in Mission Hills. The second chapter is really taking the analytical work and the public input that we've gathered over the last 6 months or so, and using that as a way to help the owner of a particular lot understand how their lot fits into the overall pattern in the city, and hence which guidelines in chapters 2 and 3 actually apply to your project and your lot. And once you've identified what style of a house you want to build, what area you're in, and what sort of massing you want to pursue, then there's some fairly concise pieces of chapters 2 and 3 that apply to you, and the rest doesn't because they apply to other people. Then in chapter 2, we apply that information to specific guidelines about designing your lot. Some of the guidelines apply to all lots in Mission Hills, and others apply specifically to certain areas depending on where you are. And then lastly, designing your house is focused on expressing, well, each property owner wants their house to fit their family, fit their lifestyle, express their aspirations and the image they want to project to the community, which is entirely encouraged. There's no micromanagement of design style. It's simply providing some guidance for how you can realize those aspirations and at the same time have a pretty good chance of your design being well received by your friends and neighbors as fitting into the community in a positive way. That we have a little summary here at the beginning about how to use the documents, which guidelines apply to my project. We've defined 3 real simple types of projects. One would be one where you're just doing site work and not really doing much with the house, and obviously the site design guidelines would be mostly pretty much all you have to pay attention to there. If, on the other hand, you're just making maintenance or alterations to the exterior architecture of your house, you're not adding big pieces or knocking it down and building a new house, then you really just need to focus on the architectural guidelines in chapter 3. But if you're doing a significant expansion of the house or a new house, then you really just sort of need to understand the whole document, you and or your design consultants. So for the approval process on the left, I won't go through the whole thing, but the first step is your due diligence. If you're thinking of buying a house or if you already own a house, to make sure you've got complete drawings that show the way the lot's developed already, to review the zoning code as it applies to your property, and review these design guidelines as they apply to your property, and review the deed information. As I think most all of you know, there are a lot of properties in Mission Hills, probably most properties in Mission Hills, have deed restrictions that were placed on the properties when Mission Hills was first subdivided. Some of those deed restrictions are probably no longer valid, having to do with various social issues that are no longer deemed appropriate. But many of them have physical restrictions about what the setback ought to be, where the building ought to be on the lot. And the city does not enforce those, but a lot of those are still most probably enforceable privately. And mostly to the point, it was in large measure those prescriptions of where to put the house that shaped Mission Hills as it was first built. Mr. Nichols, when he subdivided the lots, also said, and you need to put the house here or here or here. So inasmuch as those restrictions essentially created the patterns that you're now trying to preserve, paying attention to them is likely to also yield designs that fit with the intent of your comprehensive plan, fit with the intent of these guidelines, and fit with what we've been hearing is appropriate design in Mission Hills. Second, then, familiarizing yourself with the guidelines. I sort of already said that. And then third, a step that we think is likely to be helpful in many cases would be to consult with the city's professional staff to review your understanding of which zoning provisions apply to your property, which of these guidelines apply to your property, which area and style and other details of the guidelines would apply to your property, and make sure that you have the same understanding that's likely to be applied when you get to the ARB, so that you don't waste time and money designing something that you're then surprised about later. And then just go through the normal process of getting design review and approval. The first chapter is just the background of understanding Mission Hills. It talks very briefly about J.C. Nichols' original vision and way of executing it. Some things about how the role Mission Hills plays in the country club overall. A very brief, I mean, this is all the pages, I'm not skipping pages, discussion of how zoning has has started to define some of these patterns that it's important to preserve, and created some some outside parameters for heights and setbacks, et cetera. And then mentions the comprehensive plan objectives, which the first one is really the core idea behind these guidelines, which is, it says it's the goal of the plan, meaning the comprehensive plan, which is sort of the constitution for land use and design in a city, and in this case, Mission Hills. It's the goal of the plan to maintain the historical integrity of each part of Mission Hills as originally platted. That doesn't mean to make every house look like it was built in 1915. It means to determine what patterns make Mission Hills unique, and then don't mess them up. The comprehensive plan then expands that into 9 design principles, the first 8 of which are all talking about the green space. It's talking about the parks, it's talking about the yards, it's talking about the landscape, and essentially saying, you know, it's beautiful, don't mess it up. And then and it's so interesting because about the same percentage of the input we heard from you and your friends and neighbors was on that same subject of the green space. But the final one is really the core of what these guidelines are about. It says to maintain, and I'm going to read the whole thing because it's one sentence that sort of describes this whole document. It says the priority is preserving and maintaining the physical massing and scale of a neighborhood in terms of the proportional relationships between the size of a lot, the size of a principal building, the size and other structures located on the lot, while allowing for reasonable expansion of existing structures on the lot, or development or redevelopment of the lot. So it's about balancing property owners' legitimate interests in adapting the property, changing the property to meet their needs over time, while at the same time making it continue to be a contributing part of Mission Hills as a whole. Those patterns that Ann already discussed the left page there, which was the process. I was going to do that, but she did it better than I could in the beginning, describing how we've had conversations with a lot of people over a lot of months, and looking at patterns like on the left, the pattern of building, the pattern of blocks, the patterns of the streets, which are all pretty much set, obviously. The patterns of the buildings in each part of town, you'll notice big differences between, on the upper left there, you'll notice a much more open pattern where clearly there's a lot more open space, and then the pattern gets tighter as you go down to the southeast. And that's why those areas feel like different parts of town. And then also look a lot at the green space patterns. So that information is summarized in Chapter 1 then. The understandings that we were able to develop working with you all about what makes certain areas of Mission Hills feel quite different than certain other areas of Mission Hills. We'll go to that in the next slide, but we identified 4 what we're calling neighborhood character areas, which really feel different. They all feel like Mission Hills, but they feel different from one another. in terms of how buildings are placed, how the landscape works. And then the green space, which I won't talk about more, we'll talk about that more as we go. And then some special lot frontage conditions. The flowing green streetscape that runs everywhere in Mission Hills and sets Mission Hills apart from most other communities is punctuated by really extra special frontages at certain lots, and I'll describe those to you in a sec. So first, the neighborhood character areas. The green area along the upper left, we've called countryside estates. That's the biggest lots with the grandest houses. The purple, we've called neighborhood estates, which is sort of the prototypical Mission Hills stuff. It's impressive houses on fairly large lots with rolling terrain and a lot of landscape. Then, so there's the countryside estates, and you can see the space. There's differences in terms of the proportions of spaces between the houses. You can see a very picturesque open pattern with curving streets and hilly terrain, and that reflects itself in what it feels like to be there. The neighborhood estates are similar in sort of irregular block shapes, irregular lot shapes, big houses with a lot of green space around them. Then when you get down into the neighborhood estates area, which is basically Old Sagamore, the lots are narrower, the houses are closer together. There's a more neighborly feeling. So it's a trade-off. What you've given up, as it were, is the grand lot sizes, but what you've gained is a more intimate sort of neighborhood environment. And then the fourth neighborhood character area is the southeast portion, which are referred to variously as the ranches, or it's the post-World War II area that's characterized by squarer lots that have wide, lower-slung houses on them. So these are all, each of these areas has variation within it, but each of these areas we think is quite clearly defined by the block patterns, the street patterns, and characterized by certain types of houses. We also, because everybody talked about the green space so much, we wanted to sort of zoom in and see what the parts are that it's made of. And clearly, obviously, it's the streets, for starters. They're relatively narrow, and their rights-of-way are not very wide. They usually include about 10 feet each side. And some of the trees closest to the street are, city trees, and the rest of them are trees that are owned by by the property owner. The other public part of the green space is the many greens and parklets, the most impressive, of course, being the Verona Column Circle. But there's many others throughout town with a beautiful statuary that the comprehensive plan waxes poetic about, and justifiably so. But by percentage, probably the most acreage of this green space that everybody is so enthusiastic about is actually people's front yards, which are generally kept in a very simple palette of landscape, generally the same sort of simple green lawn that is found in the parklets and along the edges of the street, just sort of sweeps up pretty much to the house with beautiful tree canopy overhead in most cases. And that space actually sort of flows back in between the houses in most cases, which creates a strong impression of the houses being freestanding in the landscape. That's one of the more brilliant parts of the original design that was done actually by some of the most famous town planners in the world in the teens, particularly George Kessler and John Nolan. So it enhances the impression that the houses are estates and that they're surrounded by a green landscape, even though they're not that far apart, but the design really accentuates that. And then there's some very special lot frontage conditions similar to the Verona Column Circle, where the houses face toward the middle of the circle, but there's a lot of these in other contexts that are not quite so grand as the Verona Circle, but nonetheless they're very clear and they create beautiful green spaces throughout the community. So those are the main working parts of this green space, and the guidelines are keyed to those, providing certain recommendations depending on where you are in relation to those green space elements. So the chapter 2 is then designing your site, designing your lot, how you place a building, how you locate and mass a building so that it fits into the green space pattern appropriately, so that it relates to its neighbors in a nice, gentle, neighborly way, and so that it stands up and looks like a Mission Hills house. This first page is describing generally what the zoning code already says about where you place buildings on lots. It has a quick reminder of how the existing zoning and these neighborhood character areas and the green space patterns are layers that sort of build up the complicated patterns that, which is again why this guideline isn't 10 pages long, because there's just so many variations on the conditions throughout town. And then we cut right to some guidelines that apply to all lots in Mission Hills. And again, here's this diagram. The most important thing about this diagram is the idea that most Mission Hills houses, certainly the most distinctive Mission Hills houses, are essentially a big, simple mass of a house that's clearly visible, generally pretty close to the middle of the lot. And then when the house is much larger than that, which many are, of course, it's organized into additional wings that are secondary. They can be very large, but they're secondary in relation to the main house, and they're to the sides, they're to the rear. And that both provides a very strong, iconic presence for the house, and it also steps down in a neighborly way as you're getting close to the property lines. So one of the most, aside from green space and the importance of protecting it, the other thing we heard the most from folks was the idea that new houses shouldn't loom over their neighbors. And so this idea of having the pieces of the house that are toward the edges of the lot massed down a bit is to address that concern. Oh, there we go. So then in the following pages we have a bit of clear conversation about what we mean by the different kinds of wings. We cover topics. We go through a series of topics here that I'll go through very quickly that are essentially pieces of the house that could, if you weren't careful, sort of be emphasized too much and detract from the clarity of the main house, or sort of gunk up the green space, to use a technical term. And one of those is garages, which we generally suggest be set back a little bit, tucked off to the side when possible, not prominent from the street when that can be avoided. There's a series of suggestions here about how to make sure you avoid having a little wing or a retaining wall or fences sort of poking out into the green space, particularly at corners. A series of recommendations on how drives be handled, because obviously drives must go through the green space. That's how you get to your house. But that they be as inconspicuous and blend in as nicely with the green landscape as possible. We have suggestions for keeping them as narrow as practical when you're near the street, and then having them widen out when you get up near the garage, where of course you've got to be able to get in and out of the garage. And on circular driveways, ideally getting the space between the in and the out fairly wide. So there's in some cases, circular driveways, if they get on too small a lot, end up sort of making it look like you paved your whole front yard and just cut a little circle out in the middle to have some landscape. And so we're suggesting that they truly be as little paving as practical and leaving as much of an impression of green in front as possible. Here's a particular point about as you get close to corners. Some of these corner lots in quite a few parts of town have the house tilted to face the center of the intersection, and sometimes the driveway can actually shape that sort of oval or circular space in a very beautiful way. And in some cases, just sort of by not looking for those patterns, people have done driveways that would work just fine on a lot that's in the middle of a block. But when you do it on the corner, you get driveways sort of poking into that green space at the corner in funny ways. And we found as we reviewed a bunch of design applications that had generated a fair amount of discussion and controversy, often that kind of an avoidable intrusion into the green space had been the culprit. So we're offering suggestions of how to perhaps avoid that. And then a very short bit about grading and retaining, where the general idea is do it as little as possible and make it as inconspicuous as possible. The original design that Nichols and his advisors delivered here kept the existing terrain throughout town to a very remarkable degree. They graded very little, and that is one of the distinguishing characteristics that makes Mission Hills what it is. So grading as little as possible and as carefully as possible so that you can't see later on that it was ever graded is certainly a priority. And priorities for landscape is essentially simplicity and lots of trees. Those are the guidelines that apply everywhere throughout Mission Hills. We think they're equally applicable to all properties, regardless of how big the lot is or where exactly in Mission Hills it is. Then there's a set that apply to specific character areas. So in all of all these pages, only, for instance, in that first section there, neighborhood character area site design guidelines, only 2 pages apply to you, and they're the 2 pages about your character area. And then the special frontage design guidelines only apply to you if you happen to be on a creek or have a big hillside coming up into your property or are located on one of these special intersections where the houses face the center of the intersection. And we have a section, because so many of the concerns that we've heard about over time and read of in the records of the design review proceedings have to do with concerns that a new house is massed in a way that has an unwanted impact on a neighboring property. We have a little section that we added relatively recently we call neighbor-to-neighbor massing, just to make it real clear what kinds of considerations one might take when deciding how close to put a big new piece of their house to a neighbor. So the Neighborhood Estates Design Guidelines provide recommendations for the characteristic. It has the same sort of massing diagram we showed you before, and it identifies the range of sort of sizes of the main mass in terms of width, height, and depth that are most characteristic. These aren't requirements, they're norms. They're just describing what is out there and what's observed. And so if you can design a house of any size that has the pieces scaled generally in these ranges of parameters, there's a good chance that it's going to fit nicely into that character area. And one of the focal points is on the house-to-house spacing, and because that's one of the most common complaints. And so the proportions of those spaces, as the buildings get taller, then probably they need to be a little farther away from the property line. And as they get closer to the property line, they probably need to get a bit shorter, as is illustrated here on the right, where you see 2 one-story elements coming up toward each other. And then we provide recommendations for each of the character areas because they're different. That's what makes that when the comprehensive plan talks about maintaining the design integrity of each part of Mission Hills, we think these 4 areas are essentially the parts that are perceived and important. Then on the neighbor-to-neighbor massing guidelines, we've provided some diagrams, and I think a lot of you would say, well, duh, that makes sense. But I'll emphasize one more time, most of what we have written down here are principles and ideas and information that the ARB has been taking into account for a long, long time, and that most builders and architects that work a lot in Mission Hills already pretty much understand and know. And we think that just having it all written down so everybody can be, sort of playing from the same sheet music will help the conversation. It's not limited, it's not fixing a solution, but it's getting everybody started from the same point. So here we're saying that if a new addition comes to sort of the minimum setback to a rear yard, it's generally going to be a good idea to scale down the height of that a bit, whereas the house, the main mass of the house that's a long way from this neighbor standing here in the backyard can be up to the maximum height limit, but then the closer you get to the neighbor, you want to take it down a notch. And even more so if you're building on a lot that is higher than or sloping up from the lot adjacent. There's been a lot of cases that had been brought to our attention where discontent had resulted, had to do with a house that didn't drop any as it came down a hill and resulted in an overly imposing presence on the downhill neighbor. Another detail that we heard a fair amount about is that when new houses are built with greater floor-to-floor dimensions than the older houses, sometimes they look tall, too tall, or make the old house look squat by comparison. So we have just a couple recommendations here. One is that if both houses are set sort of to the minimum side setback, which in some cases means they're only about 20 feet apart, then it's more important that there be a one-story piece adjacent to the one-story house, and that unlike the bottom drawing where it shows, yes, it's one story, but on the other hand, it's a lot taller than the previous house, we're suggesting that the space between the house and the height of that one-story piece be both taken into consideration. We're not stating a specific number, but we're suggesting that you pay close attention to that, and the ARB would be paying close attention to that. And then where you're doing a new two-story house on the left with an older two-story house on the right, the bottom illustration shows a house that has floor-to-floors that are quite a bit taller than the one on the right. And the one up above shows actually floor-to-floor heights that are exactly the same as the one below, but it's possible to adjust the window proportions so that it doesn't look like it's got high water pants on. And also, if they're going to have a marked difference in floor-to-floor height, having them a little farther apart is probably a good idea. So then, that's the siting. So essentially, the site design guidelines link the question of where the house is on the lot with how it is massed in relation to the neighbors and how it is massed and organized in relation to the green space around your lot. Then when we get into Chapter 3, which is the architecture section, which we're calling Designing Your House, there's some massing recommendations, not so much focused on relationships to the neighbors, but focused more on the difference between a Mission Hills house and houses a lot of other places. And I'm going to show you, we think that there's basically 3 characteristic massing strategies that are very common and almost universal in Mission Hills and are recommended. Those include what we're calling central vertical massing, which is, this is the most characteristic American way of massing a house. It actually originates from when somebody would start by building the house they could afford, and then later, when their family grew or their fortunes expanded, they would add a wing to the side. They might add a wing to both sides. They'd add wings to the back. But the house, the original house, remained clearly defined. And when you look at houses, as we have all over Mission Hills, the clarity of that core house is just almost universal. And that you can make the house as big as you need, but you don't make it by just sort of pumping up that house, to be a bigger and bigger house. You add pieces to it. That's one of the most ingenious techniques that makes Mission Hills hang together so very well. The biggest houses, say on the right, and the smallest houses, say on the left there, have a lot of scale and proportion characteristics in common. So they all feel like they belong in the same town, even though they're very, very different in size. And so sort of the prototypical condition that you might find in the neighborhood estates area is a big house with with wings side and back. The scaled down condition of that same massing type, like you'd find in Old Sagamore, there's only, because the lots are narrow, there's usually only room for a wing on one side, and it usually has the garage in it. And then on the largest lots, a lot of times things go pretty wild with many wings, but the central house is still clearly visible and not the size of a hotel. The picturesque massing style is the second. That's almost synonymous with Tudor, and it is characterized by a clearly discernible main house mass running across the lot with gables coming forward, two gables in many cases. In Old Sagamore on the narrower lots, it'll only be probably a single gable coming forward. In every case, it'll be a very picturesque, asymmetrical yet balanced composition. It can be very flamboyant and very lovely. And then the third massing type is the horizontal, which is present mostly toward the south end of town, generally characterized by 1 or 1.5 story houses, which, when they're expanded, as we show the scaling up possibility on the right, if the second floor is added or created sort of toward the center, you'll see, not coincidentally, it ends up being quite similar to the classic Mission Hills house that we started out with in the 20s. So not only does it keep the sides a little lower where you're up next to your neighbors so they don't feel that you're making their one-story house look ridiculous, but it also sort of reinforces the unity of Mission Hills. But this is not about architecture. This is just massing. And speaking of architecture, Anne is going to finish by describing how we've touched on that, which we think is pretty lightly, to leave a great deal of freedom of expression for each property owner and their design team.
Well, this section is really about style, and one thing that we need to be really clear about is that we don't want to tell you what style to make your house. What we're doing is looking for those patterns. So we went through Mission Hills and identified the basic architectural styles that we found in Mission Hills. A lot of those are the revival styles for the 20s, and there's tons of variations, and some of you have said, well, could we just have, a lot of these are subcategories, have subcategories in them that we've just combined just to make it simpler, so this sheet didn't go on for 4 or 5 pages. So we believe there's the colonial revival style, the Tudor revival style, the neoclassical revival, which is going to include your Georgian and your Federal, the Mediterranean style, which also includes the Spanish and the Monterey and the California, is all part of that. A modern style, which is present here, the mid-century, which is the post-war houses, and the Mission Hills, what we're calling Mission Hills Contemporary. And what we found is that if you just get your house on the lot right and recognize the green space and get everything right about where you put your house with the green space, and then you get everything right about the massing of your house and how it relates to the green space and how it relates to your neighbors, you're about 90% there. Because all this is about is sort of is putting the style on the house. We played a lot of games where we could take those main massing models and almost put any one of these styles on it to make it work. That's not quite true. I mean, Tudor is pretty much the picturesque massing, and it's got to be the picturesque. But for the most part, you could decide what style you want to do. The reason that we actually included style in the design guidelines was because we wanted to make sure that if you chose a style, you knew what was appropriate to that style. That what we didn't want is for you to end up with 5 different styles on one house, because most of the time, most of you will say, that doesn't look like it fits here. It's not going to a magazine and pulling off a Tudor a Tudor bay window with a sway back roof and putting it with a French tower and then putting a Mediterranean Spanish style roof on it. It's not going to work, and it doesn't work. And we wanted to not tell you what style to use, but if you're going to use a style, these are just helpful guidelines about how to do it right. So what we've done is, I'm going to push the right button, I hope, is we've said, and I'm just going to use Tudor Revival as the example, we've talked about what massing is probably appropriate to that style. So that if you're wanting to do a Tudor house, you probably wouldn't do a horizontal massing. It just doesn't work. You're going to have trouble making that work. But, and so we try to just give you ideas about what massing style goes with what. And that's really on, let me see. Yeah, and that's across there. You can see what's going on. The other thing we did was we looked at those massing styles and where they appeared in the neighborhood. And do I have one more button if I push it? Is it gonna, across the bottom, you can see the stripes, which basically says that almost all of the styles go in every neighborhood. It's just difficult sometimes, like I talked about the Tudor, to put a Tudor, which is a basically vertical building, in a neighborhood where the style is predominantly horizontal. It's not saying you can't do it, it's just saying it's a lot more difficult to do. So we're just sort of warning you about styles and how they work. Keep one more. So on each style type, there's actually a page that talks about that style, and we're not going to go through them all. I'm just going to use Tudor as the example tonight because there's so many fabulous Tudors in Mission Hills. And so we talk a little bit about the description, about how it came about, a little historic little background on why Tudor's popular, what its defining characteristics are. And then across from that, we talk about those defining features that make, see if that pulls, yeah. On this page, we talk about those sort of defining features that make Tudor. So for example, Tudor usually has more than one type of material on it. It's usually a combination of materials, stone and brick and stucco or timber, and there's more than one, and we talk about why that is. They usually have the windows that have smaller panes in them. Sometimes you see diamond-shaped windows. The chimneys are usually elaborate, much more so than in other things. We just sort of tell you the doorways are a little different, and we go through that to describe it to you, mostly just for your edification, so you understand what that style is. And then finally, the last part of this chapter is about just general architectural guidelines. So we talk about things like exterior walls and the wall materials that we find and how to use materials properly in architecture, so that you put the heavy materials on the bottom, so that the stone would be at the base of the building and the stucco would be above it as opposed to the other way around. We talk about configurations of using multiple materials and that kind of thing. We talk about garden walls and fences and what is appropriate materials that we find a lot of in Mission Hills. And we talk about the building elements such as porches and porch columns and steps and just to give a general idea of what the expectations are of what we've seen in Mission Hills. We talk about roofs, we talk about doors and windows, and then the final thing in the document is a glossary of terms, so that as you're reading the document and you go, what is that? That you'll be able to actually look it up. So we have tried to do quite an extensive glossary, but you need to know that we didn't make all of these up. Actually, a lot of these can be found in your own zoning code that you've adopted right now. So that's at the back just to help you out, to make sure everybody's talking about the same thing. So the four big ideas that we want you to take away with tonight that these guidelines are doing are preserving and reinforcing the green space of Mission Hills, that they're responding and strengthening those early building patterns that really make Mission Hills, and the guidelines are to help you understand the mass of a house is very clearly defined, and it's one of those Mission Hills that you can just say is a Mission Hills house. people say that a lot. We hope that the guidelines help you understand that a little better. And finally, on the design of the house, we're trying to give you enough information that the house can be simple and understated and elegant, and that it's made out of fine materials that age with grace throughout the time. These are the things that we really heard from you. We've really appreciated all the input that you've given us. And if any of you would like copies of these guidelines, they're available on the web, and we've put that up here. If you go to the city's website at www.missionhillsks.gov and go to the news and information, you can actually download the guidelines yourself. So this is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for having us here, and we will take a little break here and start the Planning Commission meeting, I think.